Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to welcome everybody in the audience who are here and who are watching us remotely. I would like to welcome everybody to the next Interdisciplinary Seminar of the Wrocław University of Science and Technology. And this event is co-organized by the Wrocław Hub of Academia Europea. Now we have a very, very distinguished speaker today, Professor Eske Willerslev, and I will tell you a little bit more about his affiliation because University of Bremen is not his main affiliation. So just let me say a few words of introduction. Eske Willerslev is a Danish evolutionary genetist, and he is notable for his pioneering work on ancient DNA. But, well, I'm quite sure that everybody read about that in the announcement of this seminar. So just let me tell you that he is currently affiliated at Copenhagen University in Denmark and at the University of Cambridge, and he also holds an honorary professorship at the University of Bremen. And, well, I should say that he is very, very distinguished, and he obtained a lot of prizes and awards, but I'm not going to list them. I'm just going to tell you a little bit more of more interesting facts, like the fact that he actually spent a lot of time in Siberia, where he was collecting some materials on ethnography and the fauna. And he also lived as a fur trapper. Well, you know what the fur trapper is. These are the guys that catch some animals and then they make nice furry hats of them, right? Okay, so he spent some time in Siberia, but he also spent some time in the United States, and he is an adopted member of the Crow tribe in Montana, where he carries the name something like that, which means well-known scout. Okay, so, well, that was his early life, but then he became a distinguished member of the academia, and I'm sure that he will tell you all about what was the actual research for which he was awarded many, many things. So, Professor Willerslev.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure being here. So I thought I would tell you about two projects we are working on. They're very different, but it's to give you an idea of what ancient genomics can actually be used for. Okay, so one is on human history and understanding disease risk based on in Europe. And the other one is to secure world food security. So you can see they're very different, but they're both based on ancient DNA. And the first one, we are very far with this project. The second one, we are more in a beginning. Anyways, so in 2010, my research group did the first ancient human genome, right? So it was sequencing the complete genome from an ancient human being. And since that time, we and others have used genomics to try to understand what made humans become who we are around the world, right? What is the differences between humans? What is the similarities? And what is the underlying reasons to these differences and similarities? And we have been using ancient DNA, right? DNA from fossils, from skeletons, from teeth, from bone. You can say the drawback of using ancient DNA that are thousands, and you will see later, millions of years old, is that it's very fragmented, right? So it's in poor shape. And that makes it harder to retrieve and also to analyze. The strength of using ancient DNA is, of course, that you get a picture directly from the past, right? So rather than inferring things from the present, genomes of the present, and then you're trying to infer why did it become what it is, now you can actually go in directly and see how was it, right? So if you imagine you're looking at genomes from present-day peoples, well, maybe you can infer something about which group of people are more closely to another group of people, but you would never be able to say, where did it happen, right? What geographical place? You don't know, right? But by going back in time, you will be able to say, where did it happen? And you will also be able to put very clear constraints of when did things happen, okay? So, well, what is it? Maybe, yeah, a few years ago, we decided to do an enormous project. It was sequencing 5,000 ancient human genomes from across Western Eurasia, so Europe and Western Asia. And this covering, you can say, well, from the Upper Paleolithic, some 20,000 years ago or so, and up to the present. And as you can see here, in order to get 5,000 ancient human genomes, because of course the DNA is in a poor shape, right? We had to collect 14,700 ancient human remains from around Europe, right? And then you are drilling them, you are doing libraries, and then you go up and get around 5,000 genomes, right? And together with those ancient human genomes, you're also getting the DNA of pathogens. So infectious bacteria and DNA viruses that these peoples were carrying at the time of death. Okay, I'll show you what you can use that for later. Okay, so what can this type of genomes tell us about? What can it tell us about our history in Europe and Asia? So here we have, it's from Russia actually, it's from close to Moscow. One of the very early hunter-gatherers, one of the very early modern humans, anatomically modern humans, our species, right? He's called Kostinski 14 and is between 36 and 38,000 years old. And what we can see is, well, Kostinski 14 is not a direct ancestor to any of us today, but he's closer related to people from Western Eurasia, from Europe and Western Eurasia today than to any other present-day people, right? So it tells us already from these very early modern humans there's some degree of continuity in Western Eurasia, okay? We can also infer something about the behavior of these early people. So this is another site, also just outside Moscow, called Sungir. It's around the same age, but it's unique by you have multiple individuals. It's very rare, but you actually have multiple individuals that are buried together, right? So it's all people from the same area from the same time. And what we can see is, maybe not very surprisingly, it's a very low effective population size. It means these were living in very small groups. However, people based on morphology, looking at bone structure and all that, had claimed, well, these people are super inbred, right? So that was one thing, because they're living in these small groups. One of them have a bone with red ochre as an amulet, and there it was claimed, well, this is a Neanderthal that they killed, right? So what do we see? We see nothing like it. These peoples are not closely related at all, and they are absolutely not inbred. They're actually very outbred, right? And the bone, the so-called Neanderthal amulet, was actually one of their own ancestors, right? It wasn't a Neanderthal. So what it tells us is that even though our ancestors were living in very small groups, very isolated from anybody else, right? They actually knew the importance of finding mates that were not part of themselves, right? And this is in striking contrast to the Neanderthals, right? That were living almost around the same time, a little bit before in Europe, where we can see from their genomes, they're super inbred, right? Very, very inbred. So I'm speculating now, but this might be one of the behavioral differences between our species, modern humans, and, Neanderthals. Okay, so not in terms of lifestyle, not much is happening in Europe until around 10,000 years ago, right? We're living as hunter-gatherers. We've been like that since our ancestors left Africa 60 to 90,000 years ago. It's the same thing, right? Lifestyle-wise. What happens around 10,000 years ago? Well, we start getting agriculture, right? we become farmers. And we know now from ancient DNA studies this is due to a movement of peoples from the Middle East and Near East that has domesticated plants and animals, and now they're moving up through Europe. What we can see is that these peoples are only going on the western side of Europe and not to the very east of Europe. And it's very strange that there is kind of a divide going from the Baltic states down to around the Black Sea area, where you already, with the hunter-gatherers, can see two distinct groups that doesn't have much to do with each other. We don't know why. There's no physical barrier, right? So it must be a cultural barrier. And these farmers that are moving up seems to only like to go on the western side of this barrier and mixing up and engaging with the hunter-gatherers. On the eastern side, they remain hunter-gatherers. So they remain hunter-gatherers for way longer. And this will have consequences when I'm talking later about disease risk and different traits, okay? It's the biggest lifestyle change we know in human history. So you're going from a diet of meat, berries, roots, fish, right? To a diet of basically something similar to muesli, day out and day in, right? Very rich in carbohydrates, and it's so severe that it actually changes our DNA. For example, the fats region, which is involved in making short-chain fatty acids into long-chain fatty acids, right? When you are eating meat and fish, you're getting long-chain fatty acids directly from your meal. When you're eating muesli, they're coming as short-chain fatty acids, and the body itself has to change it into long-term fatty acids. So this has severe consequences. This meeting between the hunter-gatherers and these early farmers from the Middle and Near East, in some places, you know, it results, particularly in Southern Europe, it would result in a lot of admixture, right? So Southern Europeans today genetically almost look identical to these peoples who came from the Middle and Near East, who lived there back 10, 12,000 years ago, okay? But as they move north, you can say their genetic impact becomes smaller. And if you go to a place like Denmark, I'm from Denmark, right? Which is far to the north, there what we can see is that these mixed individuals, these that had mixed to the south, hunter-gatherers to the south, mixed with the farmers in the south, now farmers in lifestyle moving into Denmark, they erase the whole population of Denmark within 2 generations. So, I mean, every ethnic Dane, we had people, humans in Denmark going back like 14,000 years, but I'm not deriving from them, and neither is any of present-day ethnic Danes, okay? So we don't know exactly what happens. We don't find any evidence of disease. My theory, but it's only a theory, is it's basically a genocide that happens, right? It went 2 generations, just gone. Other people say they fled to Norway or Sweden or something like that. But if you try to take a sailing boat from Denmark to Norway and imagine you're doing that in a canoe, good luck. Just saying. Okay, so now Europe has become, large part of Europe has become farmers, right? Still in the Far East, people remain hunter-gatherers at this stage. But then things are happening again. Now we're going into the so-called Bronze Age. This happens around 5,000 years ago. And many people thought it was just the same people around Europe learning to do something new, right? Using metals, bury the dead in new ways, etc. But what we can see is this is wrong. What happens is there is a major migration event again around 5,000 years ago. This time from the Pontic steppe, right? So this is the areas of today's present-day Ukraine, Belarus, these areas. And we have a group, it's a herding people. They are herding cows and sheep, and we call them Yamnaya. They're pastoralists, okay? And we see 5,000 years ago a movement into northwestern Europe from the Pontic steppe, but also eastwards into West and Central Asia. And when linguists saw this, they got very excited because it goes directly into the debate of the origin of the Indo-European languages, right? So the Indo-European languages are the most widely spoken languages today. It's English, French, German, Danish, Swedish, etc. And there was, of course, many different theories. When did they originate, these Indo-European languages, and how did they spread, right? And there's all these theories, but what was interesting was, well, one of these linguistic theories predicted exactly this scenario, that 5,000 years ago on the Pontic steppe, you had a northwestern migration and an eastward migration, okay? The steppe theory. So these Yamnaya people are having an enormous impact, and genetically, and you will see culturally and so forth. So this is an old paper now, 15, but the principles are the same. So in gray, you see the genetic diversity of present-day Europeans, right? You see that there's some differences between Northern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, Western Europeans, Southern Europeans. And if you look at the late hunter-gatherers, they're basically falling outside most of this genetic diversity. If you go to the farmers in the middle, they are also kind of outside the genetic diversity. It's first when you get to the Bronze Age that you get a pattern that looks like present-day Europe, or similar, I would say, to present-day Europe. So one thing we can already learn here is that the genetic diversity, if you want, that we see across Europe, it's very recent, right? It's due to events that are very recent. Within, you can say, it's only not even finished 5,000 years ago, but the major patterns are first established 5,000 years ago. And this is a very different storytelling from what I learned in school, at least, right? Where it was all about people have been staying put at the same place for, many, many thousands, tens of thousands of years. This is not the case. It's a very recent world, okay? So Yamnaya has this huge impact, particularly on Northwestern Europe, and you will see in terms of disease risk the consequences of this in a moment. When we go to the east, right, Yamnaya also moves to the east. So going into Western Asia, Central Asia, and for some reason they never have the same impact as they have in Europe. And we didn't know why. We find them there, they're definitely there, but they just don't mix a lot with the local population. And who are the local population at that time, 5,000 years ago? Well, it's actually a very ancient group of peoples that has remained hunter-gatherers. And these peoples are, you can say, they are the ancestors, one of the most important ancestral branches that later becomes Native Americans. But this is a different story, okay? But it's also the first peoples that we know of that domesticate the horse. And this is from a site called Botai in Kazakhstan, which is around 6,000 years ago, and you find horses with marks in the teeth of bristles, milk residues, right? So they were milking the horses. You can only do this if they're domesticated, okay? So this is speculation from my end, but maybe the reason why Yamnaya never get a foothold there is because these guys have the horses, right? And people thought it was Yamnaya that taught them how to domesticate the horse, but this is not the case. These guys domesticated the horse themselves. We have good evidence for this. And the domestic horse we all know of today, right? The one we all kind of know of, this is a separate event from that of Botai, right? That is then being spread to the rest of the world. The Botai people doesn't spread it to the rest of the world. But potentially that is why Yamnaya never really get a foothold. Here it's just to show you that these ancestors of the people living in Eastern Europe, Western and Central Asia at that time, they are related to something called the Maltar skeleton, which is 24,000 years old from Lake Baikal in Siberia. And this skeleton is ancestral. You can see who it's most closely related to. It's Native Americans, right? So these guys, you can say, while some went over here and mixed with a basal Asian group creating Native Americans, of course, not everybody went over there, right? So some remained, and those are the ones domesticating the horse, okay? Here we have it with the horse domestication. Okay. So what happens next? Well, now in Europe, you can say the overall patterns have been formed, right? In Southern Europe, people are mainly of ancestry of the farmers that came in, right? That's the majority of the ancestry. In Northern and Western Europe, it's mainly the ancestry mainly derives from the Yamnaya that came from the Pontic steppe. In Eastern Europe, in the very eastern part, it's mainly still hunter-gatherer ancestry. We still have other ancestries, but the main ancestry is hunter-gatherers still. But now what happens is we have now got the domestic horse all over Europe and also Western and Central Asia. And in Northern and Northeastern Europe, they invent the chariot, right? The two-wheel wagon. And this is an unstoppable war machine, right? So you have one riding the chariot, and then you have one with bow and arrow shooting. And these guys have many names. Some call them battle axe culture, others call them centasta. It's all the same thing, right? And they basically migrate out of Europe, also Eastern Europe, where we are now, migrating, expanding into Western and Central Asia, and devastating everything on the way. So these guys, you know, that domesticated the horse at Potai, right? These guys, gone. When these guys are coming, it's the end of the original inhabitants in Western and Central Asia. Okay, so now everybody got the horse. And therefore, you can say the most important place in the world at this time, also late into our history, is the Eurasian steppe, right? That stretches from Eastern Europe all the way to East Asia. And this is, we also know it as the Silk Route, right? I mean, this is the steppe area. When you didn't have a horse, nobody wanted to be there, right? It's dry and no water, but now you had the highway, but you didn't have the car. Now you have the car, right? The horse. So it means now you can use this for trade, and the ones that controls the steppe controls the trade between Asia and Europe. And first it's these centasta or battle axe people, but they are soon taken over by these guys here, which are the Scythians, right? And when we test them genetically, who are the Scythians? The Scythians is an amazing culture, right? I mean, beautiful gold ornaments. It's an amazing culture. It's a multi-ethnic culture. So there's remnants of Europeans, of these centasta battle axe people that become Scythians. There's people coming down from the Siberian forest of Asian ancestry that also become Scythians, right? So it's a multi-ethnic culture. It's quite interesting. They don't mix a lot with each other, but they have still have, you can say, a very homogeneous culture. It's a very unique setting. And both males and females are mounted warriors, riding on horses, mounted. They are, the cover, they have the arrows and are made of human skin from their enemies, right? So pretty violent people. But even these guys can't hold the steppe. The next group taking over is the Huns, right? And who are the Huns? Well, the Huns are coming out of China, right? They're coming out of the Xiongnu Confederation of China. They're spreading across the steppe. They are mounted warriors, and they are creating a society with an elite, right? The elite society, themselves being on the top, and then the rest being in the bottom. And the rest are mainly of European origin at this time, okay? But that means they don't mix a lot with you can say, the lower class, right? So they have this East Asian upper class consisting of Huns, dominating mainly people of European descent that are sitting below. So the people of European descent are talking Indo-Iranian, which is an Indo-European language. The Huns, on the other hand, are talking Turkish. And they don't have a lot of genetic impact in Europe and in West Asia and in Central Asia, but they have a huge linguistic impact, right? So they're changing large parts of these areas from being Indo-Iranian speaking to becoming Turkish speaking. So it's pretty crazy to think about, right? We are now in the Iron Age. It's not that long ago, a couple of thousand years ago, right? And there was a bunch of Europeans looking like most of us here that were speaking Turkish, right? It's a very different world. But of course we know that's not how the world looks today. Today, the vast majority of these areas here are of East Asian origins, right? It's East Asian peoples speaking Turkish. So how do we get to that? Well, that's the Mongolian invasion, right? From Central Asia. And they have this huge impact genetically on, you can say, the populations, and changing them from being primarily of European ancestry to becoming of East Asian ancestry. So you can see that the worlds we are talking about are super young. In Europe, within the last 5,000 years, right, the world we know of. In Western and Central Asia, we are up in medieval times, right? It's like 1,000, 1,500 years ago. Very, very young worlds we are looking at. Okay, just quickly with Vikings, because I'm Danish. You need to hear about that. So who are the Vikings? Well, we all know them from films and series stuff, right? Big blonde men meeting, the Jarls meeting from different parts of Scandinavia, going out, raiding together, in Europe, right? That's the kind of the story. How much of this story is actually true, right? What is it based on? All these movies, all these books. It's based on the so-called sagas, Icelandic sagas, which are written records that was created hundreds of years after the Viking period, right? With a very specific political purpose, namely of portraying the Vikings as being amazing warriors and big and strong and all that. If you actually go and do genetics and try to test some of these theories, what do we see? Well, first of all, there was fewer blonde Vikings than there's blonde Scandinavians today, right? Secondly, you find Vikings, yes, the Viking era comes out of Scandinavia, but you find Vikings that are half Southern European, half Scandinavian, half Sami, which is the indigenous peoples in northern Scandinavia, half European Scandinavian. You even find Vikings buried with swords and shields and the whole lot. In, for example, Scotland, they have no Scandinavian ancestry, right? So in other words, what is a Viking? A Viking is a lifestyle, right? It's not an ethnicity. Everybody could become a Viking, right? And in terms of, you can say, where are things happening during the Viking period? We always see in the movies things are happening in Norway, right? Well, Norway is beautiful, makes a good movie, I'm sure, compared to other places in Scandinavia. But where we can see there's real diversity, where people are coming in, trading, doing stuff, that's actually a part in Denmark, and then it's Öland and Åland in Sweden. The rest of it is kind of the outskirts of the Viking period, Viking area. There was people living there, but there's not many who wants to come and visit, okay? We can also see where the different Viking groups, where did they go? So we can see that the Swedish Vikings are mainly going to the Baltics, right? The Danes are mainly going to England, and the Norwegians are the ones going the furthest away, right? So they're going to both Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland, right? We can also go and look at these raiding parties. There's been found only one raiding party archaeologically. We have all these stories of their raidings, right? But there's only one raiding party. And that has been found in Estonia, right? Where a group of Vikings comes in, they're getting killed off, buried with shields and everything. So you have kind of a snapshot of a raiding party. It's nothing like all the Jarls meeting from different parts of Scandinavia. It's a small local village in Sweden. It's brother Bob and cousin Ben, drink too much beer, whatever, going out raiding, and it goes wrong. So this whole narrative of, people having these huge armies going out, we don't see it. I'm not saying it's not true, but there's no scientific evidence for it, right? Okay, so now, hopefully it's maybe not too bad. Okay, so what have we learned so far, which is important? Well, Europe, all Europeans are basically formed by three major migration events. It's the original hunter-gatherers that came to Europe, right? It's the farmers that came from the Middle and Near East into Europe starting around 10,000 years ago. And it's the Yamnaya people that came in early Bronze Age around 5,000 years ago. What makes Europeans different from each other, Eastern Europeans from Western Europeans, from Northern Europeans, from Southern Europeans, is the amount of each of these three ancestries, okay? It's the relative amount, how much do you have, right? So Eastern Europeans have more hunter-gatherer, Western Europeans have more Yamnaya, Southern Europeans have more farmer ancestries, okay? So can we use this to say something about why are we different from each other? And how are we different from each other? And the answer is yes, right? Because we now have a very good idea of what do the genomes of the hunter-gatherers look like, the farmers look like, the Yamnaya Bronze Age people look like. And we, if you know, I don't know if you know about this, but there's a thing called UK Biobank, right? Which contains all information from Europe, particularly Britain, but Europe as such, on genotype-phenotype relationships. So it says, what DNA mutations are coding for different traits, right? So you can take these genomes of these ancient people and you can paint UK Biobank, right? And then ask, well, what kind of disease risks are coming with each of these migrations, or phenotypic traits are coming with each of these migrations. So for example, right, you can see there's a genetic background for height, right? So if you get enough to eat, it's still you need enough to eat, but if you get enough to eat, you have different potentials, right, for being very tall or less tall. And these genetic mutations that makes you very tall, or quite tall, they seem to originate from the Yamnaya migration, right? Actually makes sense, right? Because the Yamnaya migration has its biggest, you can say, print in Northern and Northwestern Europeans. And they are in general taller than other Europeans, right? If you look at things like, for example, diabetes type 2, the risk alleles coming with those seems to be coming with hunter-gatherers, right? The same with Alzheimer's. That doesn't mean you are getting it. It's very important to say. It's the risk. It means if, let's say, you're eating pizza and drinking Coke all day around and you have a lot of hunter-gatherer ancestry, that means that your statistical risk of getting diabetes type 2 is higher than somebody who has another ancestry of the three ancestries, okay? And the same with, let's say, if you are it's a trait where you are kind of very worried or very thoughtful and very worried about, you know, the future. It's a genetic trait, and that can be traced back to the farmers, right? Okay, so you can use this to kind of understand what is the underlying reason for differences in phenotype and genetic risk. And if we go a little bit deeper with one of these. So this is, it's not impressive, it's actually been published, sorry about that, but it's multiple sclerosis, right? So multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease, right? It's a disease where the immune system attacks the body of the individual. It has a very high frequency in Northern Europe, right? And particularly in Scandinavia. And it has been heavily discussed why. Why is the frequency so high of this disease in these places compared to other places in Europe, right? Can we look at this? Yes, if you look at where do these risk alleles for multiple sclerosis come from? Where do they come from? They come from the Yamnaya migration, right? We can see they originate around 5,000 years ago on the Pontic steppe with Yamnaya. And what is quite striking is it's selected positively for. What does that mean? It means that the people carrying these genetic mutations that today are increasing your risk of multiple sclerosis, in the past had an advantage. They get more children that survives. And we can see it's selected for, even when Yamnaya goes into Europe, it's still selected for, okay? What's the reason? I mean, isn't that weird? I mean, strange. Well, if you look at the pathogens, right, we can take out, when we sequence the DNA of these ancient teeth, as I said, we are not only getting the DNA of the humans, we are also getting the DNA of the, you can say, the microbes, the bacteria and DNA viruses these people were carrying. So you can find things like plague, for example. We find a massive plague outbreak 5,000 years ago. Starting 5,000 years ago, it was thousands of years earlier than anybody thought, right? You can go and look at smallpox. We find all kinds of pathogens in these peoples. If you try to bring all these together, right, and say, okay, what do the pathogen picture look like? Well, we can see there's always been pathogens. That's not a big surprise, right? But the pathogens, the so-called zoonotic pathogens, the pathogens that are jumping from animals to humans, we first see them in our data sets all over Europe and West Asia 6,500 years ago. And 5,000 years ago, they explode, totally explode. And the world of pathogens that we know historically and today of these zoonotic pathogens, that's when they come about. And where does it happen? On the pontic steppe, where Yamnaya is, right? So if you imagine you are Yamnaya 5,000 years ago, you are bombarded by infectious diseases, right? And of course you need an immune system that is extraordinary, right? Extraordinarily powerful. And that keeps going, but when we get into the modern day era, right, of course then you have penicillinum and all kinds of treatments, and a lot of these pathogens are just removed, right? And the immune system, you still have this over-efficient immune system, and now it becomes a problem and attacks the body itself, right? Do you see? So an important learning from this is, when we talk about genetic traits being bad or good or whatever, we have this tendency, right, to look at things good or bad, and oh my God, you were born with bad genes for diabetes or whatever it is, right? It's all in an environmental context, right? Something which is bad here might be good over there, right? So of course, we haven't done the experiment, right? But if you imagine people with higher risk of multiple sclerosis, for example, being born in the slum of Bombay, right? It might well actually be advantage, right, to have it. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's about what environment you're in, right? This is the thing we see from this data, is that something which is bad or whatever is looking as, unlucky today, might not have to be unlucky in the past, right? Because the environment was different, right, in these areas. Okay, that's my first talk. Do I still have time? Yes. Good. Then we go to the next one. This is very different topic. This is it's a project we started 6 months ago, a little more than 6 months ago. And it's 18 different institutions around the world that has gone together. We are heading it, but it's all these institutions. And what we are trying to address is one of the very big challenges we will face on this earth, and this is food security. So because of climate change, our food security in the world, including Europe, is actually under threat, right? So the predictions are that because of climate change, we will be suffering. Our crops are not capable of, you can say, resist drought and other climate events. So, I mean, very simplified, you can say, well, how have we handled our agriculture so far? Well, we have selected for yield, right? That has been the thing we have been interested in. Yield, 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 on the expense of everything else. And everything else, other problems we have handled with a lot of fertilizer, a lot of pesticides, and in many places in the world also a lot of water. And that has never been good for the environment, but it has kind of worked in terms of getting something in our mouth. But now, because of climate change, that doesn't work anymore, okay? So our crops are monocultures, and they can't resist these drastic climate fluctuations. And this is a problem. It's predicted that even Europe might not be able to sustain itself, right? Because of climate change in terms of food. So can we do something about it? People have so far been crossing land races, old land races they find in a valley in Italy or whatever, trying to cross that into the major races that people are breeding, but it's not sufficient. We need to do something else, okay? So, and at the same time, of course, you can say another related problem is what we call the biodiversity crisis, right? I mean, we are losing a lot of species. And why? It's actually also because of climate change, but the majority of the problem is how we farm. This is about this, all with these fertilizers and pesticides, and it's killing off a lot of the biodiversity, which is not good either, right? And we're trying to tackle both problems. So the vision here is really to build more sustainable and secure food production systems while also preserving biodiversity in cropping systems under climate change. And the way we want to do this is by mining ancient environmental DNA, okay? And this is where I'm going now. But before I tell you what environmental DNA, ancient environmental DNA is, then I will tell you that the biggest problem we are facing in handling this problem is not to, you can say, genetically edit our crops. We have really efficient tools, right? CRISPR, but there's also non-GMO tools to get certain base insertions into your crops. We're very good at putting new microbes into a cropping system and saying, well, can we actually get a change in the soil structure, etc. The problem we're facing is we don't know what to change, right? These genomes are massive, right? And we don't know, most of it we don't know. So you can sit changing, editing genomes in crops forever without finding a solution to what you have of a problem, because you don't know what to edit, right? It's an endless. So this is where we think we can do something. We can find out what do we need to edit under which environmental conditions, okay? So what is this ancient environmental DNA? This is actually where I started my career, so now it's like full circle back. So when I was a student, I discovered something pretty remarkable out of necessity. It wasn't because I was clever, it was because nobody wanted to give me fossils. So I thought I had to find out something from materials that no one are interested in, but turns out to be really important, right? Not very easy, but I was looking out the window in an autumn day, right? And I saw, we all know this from this part of the world, right? Leaves falling from the trees. You know, there was a dog that took a crap on the street, and suddenly it struck me, we know there's DNA in the leaves, right? We know there's DNA in the dog feces. But we also know the next time it has rained, the dog feces is gone. And after a few years, right, the leaves are gone. The question I asked myself was, what happens to the DNA? Could the DNA survive, right? Would it be possible to take soil samples and retrieve not only microbes, as people had shown before, but also reconstruct plant and animals of the ecosystem, both in the present and in the past? And to make a long story short, that turned out to be the case, okay? So basically, we didn't know this at the time, but now I've been walking back and forth here, right? My DNA is all over this floor. All living organisms are shedding DNA to their surroundings. So if you gave me like a gram of soil from your garden at home, I would be able to tell you what kind of plants do you have in your garden, many of your plants. I would be able to tell you, has the neighbor's cat or dog been passing your garden recently, or even worse, have your neighbor been in your garden, right? Because everything is shedding DNA. And not only can you find that in the present, you can go back and you can find it in the past as well, right? So what was once the surface, the DNA, because it is preserved down there. And this is what we showed in this paper back in 2003, right? That you can get it both from the present and from the past. Tens of thousands of years back in time. So this is important because, well, what other means do we have to understand the past, right? What we had before environmental DNA was really some bones, right? Pollen and plant macrofossils. So if we wanted to find out what was here 10,000 years ago, right, we would dig a hole, hope we landed on some sediments that are about 10,000 years ago, the chance that we would find a bone from an animal would be tiny, right? You might find a bone 50 kilometers away from that time, and then you would say, well, maybe that animal also lived here. You will find some pollen, and you would reconstruct the plants community based on that. Macrofossils of plants, also very unlikely. You might find those 100 kilometers in another direction. And what people then had done so far was they said, well, we think they were all together here, even though they were found there and there. With environmental DNA, you have the whole ecosystem of the past, from microbes, right, bacteria, fungi, animal, plants, mammals, birds. You get it all, and you know in this gram of soil you are looking at, or less than a gram, what you find in there, they were all here at this time, right, in this place, okay? And that means, of course, you can do a total different reconstruction of ecosystems. Just to give you a couple of examples, then I go to what we're trying to do, how we have used this in the past, right? So here we have, for example, there has been a huge debate of the peopling of the Americas, when people moved from Siberia into North America, right? It's believed that they were crossing a land bridge connecting Siberia with North America, with Alaska. And those parts were ice-free, largely ice-free during the last glaciation. But the rest of North America was covered by two massive ice caps, okay? And it's first, at some point around 13,000 years ago, then these two ice caps are moving aside, and a 1,500 kilometer long interior ice-free corridor was formed. And school books put arrows through there and said, this is where humans moved down from Alaska into the rest of North America, Central America, South America, right? But no one had asked themselves, what could you live from? You have to walk 1,500 kilometers, right, on ice caps of each side. What did they live from? And there we could go in and take lake course, right? This is a lake that was also a lake back when the ice-free corridor opened, right? And then you can reconstruct the biological succession of the interior ice-free corridor using environmental DNA, just by pulling DNA out of the sediments of the lake. We can see that the first few thousand years, there's only bacteria and fungi, right? Then you establish a steppe environment with Artemisia. You get things like woolly mammoth, bison DNA, right? Then after a few thousand years, you get the DNA of populous forests, and the animal life changes into things like red deer, right? And after a few more thousand years, you get boreal forest as you have today, and the animal life changes into moose, right? So we can follow the whole succession of this area, and what we can see is at the time where we know for sure that humans were south of these ice caps, there was nothing to live from in the interior ice-free corridor. In other words, this is not the route they took in, right? They took another, probably along the west coast. So this is one example. Another example, just briefly, there's two papers we worked on where we took samples, sediment samples, permafrost samples around the northern hemisphere, right? And could reconstruct then, you can say, the vegetation and animal life over the last 50,000 years. And that could go into this whole debate of what killed off the big-bodied mammals, what we call the megafauna, and the end of the last ice age, right? It's the last mass extinction we have on Earth, right? We had a world of elephants, rhinos, lions, hyenas, right, in the northern hemisphere, and that world ended sometimes after the end of the last ice age, right, around 10,000 years ago or so. And it's 2/3 of all the big-bodied mammal genera disappeared. And people have discussed for ages, right, for more than 100 years, what was the underlying cause? Was it humans that killed them, or was it climate change, right, that drew this extinction? And here we can reconstruct the environment. And what do we see? Well, we see massive changes in the vegetation. It starts by being a steppe environment during the Ice Age, and then it becomes, you can say, the world we know of today in these areas, which consist of trees, shrubs, and grasses. And we can see that the animals are changing with the vegetation. So the vegetation changes first, earliest in Europe and Alaska. And that's also where we see in the dirt the disappearance at the same time as the vegetation changes. We see the disappearance of woolly mammoth, steppe bison, rhinos, all these things. The next part that changes is northeastern Siberia. And that happens around 10,000 years ago. And that's where we see the disappearance of these animals there. Where do they survive? Well, they survive the longest here on the Taimyr Peninsula in northern central Siberia. There we find mammoth DNA, which is only 5,000 years old in sediments, right? And there the vegetation also first changes around 5,000 years ago, right? So it really suggests, well, it's climate driving the vegetation changes, and it's the vegetation changes that drives the extinction, and not humans that kill these animals. I'm not saying they didn't kill them. I'm just saying they didn't kill them to an extent where it really mattered, right? Okay. So hopefully now you got the idea, right? You can take cores, either lake cores, sediment cores, or other type of cores of dirt, of soil across time. And then you can reconstruct, you can say, the diversity of organisms there. You can see what is changing, which organisms are disappearing, right? You can even look at selection, right? You can even say something about what genes are under selection under different environments. So how can we use this to improve our crops? Well, the rationale is quite simple. We know, right, that climate change have happened many times in Earth history, right? Natural, without human impact. It's first here over the last, since the industrialization, that humans have an impact on, right? But even before that time, climate has been changing. We also know from Charles Darwin and others, right, that you can say species respond to these climate changes by changing their DNA, right, through mutations. Get mutations, they have an advantage, they're segregated in the population, it changes. That's evolution, right? We also know from our environmental DNA work that communities, you can say, the ecosystems, right, is changing. The composition of species, which species are together, are also changing. We also have an idea that today we have very limited diversity in our crops, right? We have very limited genetic diversity because we only selected for yield. On the expense of everything else, we also have very limited genetic diversity in our fields, right, in terms of bacteria, fungi, and others. But we expect when we go back in time, we will get increasing diversity, right? So what can we do, right? How can we use this? Well, if you imagine you go in different places in the world in different time periods, right? Take slices, right? You will have nature's own response to climate change, right? That's basically, nature survived, right? We're here. They responded, nature adapted. Some of these adaptations has been lost ever since, right? Because it was warm 125,000 years ago, but then it became very cold, right? And of course you need other adaptations and you lose some of the original mutations, right? But if you go back to the warm periods, well, you will get the warm adaptations, right? From different periods, okay? And this is exactly what we are doing or planning to do. So we are sampling all over the world, right? Ancient sediment samples from different environment conditions, right? Where it was hot, but to the very far north, for example, right? Or where we go from the transition from the green Sahara to the warm Sahara, right? Where it's flooded multiple times. All kinds of conditions. And then we're mining this environmental DNA data both for what organisms are together and trying to reconstruct the functions of the ecosystem, as well as what genetic adaptations are important, okay? So, let me give you an example. Here we have, we published this a few years ago. It's the oldest DNA ever retrieved to date, right? So we retrieved this is 2 million year old DNA. It's coming from northern Greenland, from a place called the Cap Copenhagen Formation. You see that to the left, right? It's what you call a polar desert. There's nothing. It's like Sahara, right? The rainfall is like Sahara, right? So a very barren place. If you go in and take these sediments 2 million years ago, at that time the temperatures were 10 to 15 degrees Celsius warmer than today, right? But Greenland were in exactly the same spot. It was to the far north. Half a year was polar night, half a year was daylight, 24 hours, right? Just like today, it's in the same place, but it was way warmer. And you reconstruct, what did the ecosystem look like 2 million years ago? It looks like this, right? You find a diverse forest, you find ants, you find dung beetles, they're not present in Greenland at all today. You find larynx trees, right? Tuya trees, you find hares, you find geese, you find reindeer, you find mastodons, which are these extinct elephants. It's an ecosystem with no present-day analog. You can't find it anywhere in the world today. It's a mixture between species that are today found, or their relatives are found in the Arctic today, with species where you can say the relatives are found in the temperate region. You don't find it to any place, right? So if you go in and say, people have predicted that future climate change will be very much looking like the Pliocene. This is the Pliocene. This is what the Pliocene looks like, okay? This is the closest, some of the closest we have to the world we might be facing some 10 years or whatever from now. Okay, can we use this to basically improve crops so we could get them, for example, to grow up there, right? They can't grow there today. Okay, in order to do this, I won't do, because I'm running out of time, but we use methods, we have developed methods where we are basically identifying amino acid substitutions, which you cover across multiple species in the ecosystem, okay? So it's not exactly the same nucleotide mutation, but it's the same amino acid, okay? And that tells us, of course, when you find that, let's say in Cap Copenhagen 2 million years ago, and you find it across many different plants and also some animals and some fungi or whatever, you know this mutation is important, right? Because you find it across many, many taxa in this ecosystem. So we know this is very important for surviving here. So you can identify them like this. And for example, some of the things we're finding is related to the whole light pathway, right? And this is maybe not a big surprise, right? Because Greenland was positioned exactly the same place, right? So 2 million years ago, there was half a year of polar night, half a year of sun, right? And the sun angle is very steep, so it's very poor quality, you can say, light, right? And this is a big problem. If you want to grow a barley there today, they can't grow there. Because, not only because of the temperatures, but also because of the light conditions. So you want to improve the light conditions. The temperature climate change takes care of, right? But the light condition, it doesn't. How can we improve it, right? And we find these different mutations, right, in the light pathway. We can then, so then we can translate those into plants. I'll give you an example in just a moment, but before I do that, I'll just show you, when you have this type of data, you can also look across time and space. So here we have one of these light receptors. This is a red light receptor, part of photosynthesis to grow, right? Very important. Now we have samples here. This is just 4 samples, right? So of course it's limited, but 2 million year old DNA up from northern Greenland, 1,000-year-old DNA from Iceland, 175,000-year-old DNA from Mediterranean, 8,000-year-old DNA from Greenland, from China. What do we see? Well, in the north, the 2 northernmost ones, we see it exactly the same amino acid that is changed to survive across the 2 communities. In the 2 closer to equator, it's exactly the same amino acid that is changed, but it's different to the one in the far north, right? Do you see what I'm saying? You can see it. Now, of course, you know, if you want to grow something down here, right? And this is across thousands to millions of years. If you want to grow something down here, you better get that one, right? If you want to grow something up here, you better get this one. So this is how you can use this. So here, this is actually the first experiment we did. This is a blue light receptor 2 million years ago, old, identified up in this Cap Copenhagen. Well, you can get it into a barley plant, and this is not even done with CRISPR. This is a non-GMO method called find it, right? So it doesn't even have to be genetic manipulation as such. So you're using nature's own solution, right? And we have some preliminary experiments now where it's growing under different light conditions, and it actually looks like the mutant is growing better, right? See? So another example, as we talked about, we can also go back into domestic ecosystems, right? Like rice. Rice is the second or third most important crop in humanity. And it was domesticated in China about 10,000 years ago, right? If we go into China lakes, which we have done, and look at rice DNA, close to fields where we know archaeologically they did rice domestication, you can see the genetic diversity is exactly as we expected, right? It's highest in the past, and then it becomes lower and lower and lower. And we can even follow how they domesticate different traits, right? So some traits like seed shattering, that you can actually get your bloody seed from the plant. Well, that seems to be very crucial, right? They do domesticate this very fast, while other things like grain size and plant height is taking way longer time. But when you go in, and this is the interesting part, right? When you go into these data sets where we have thousands of year old rice, we go into genes we know even today are super important for rice traits. You see an enormous amount of unknown mutations, right? Many of these could be super interesting, right? In terms of, well, how could rice be adapted to another environment, right? For example, one of those is what is called MKK3. What is MKK3? MKK3 is a gene that are very important for when a seed germinates, right? So MKK3, whether you can say have a very dormant seed can be good if you want to store it for a long time under many different weather conditions. But of course, if you want to have a fast production in a climate where you, for example, could do cropping twice a year, you want the seed to really germinate fast, right? And MKK3 is crucial for this. We find in these rice data mutation in MKK3 that is unknown today, right? And then you can express it into bacteria, right? And see, does it have an effect? Yes. It actually really changes protein activity. And then you can put it into, not even a rice plant, we put it into a barley plant, right? And what do we see? The seed germinates extremely fast, right? So it's an adaptation, you can say, to a system where you need things to not be very sensitive. I actually hope for the opposite, but, well, that's what we got. But this actually makes sense because if you look at the climate data, we found it around 8,000 years ago. And at that time, the environment is way drier in China, in these parts of China, than it is today. So you have something that needs to not be kicked very hard before it can start growing, right? Which is, you can say, a different problem today because there the problem is premature sprouting, right? And you lose the whole package, right? So that's why I hope for something that would be more resilient, so to speak, to germination. But you get the idea behind it, right? And now we are testing all kinds of these traits related to all kinds of things, right? Where we can stuff it into either rice or into barley and then see, what is the phenotypic response, right? And we can also do the same with microbial traits. As I said, it's not only the plants, but also the ecosystem around the plants. And this is the final, I will be done now. So if you look, for example, you can, based on the ancient environmental DNA, you can reconstruct the nitrogen cycle in these communities, right? And what is it we want? We want the nitrogen to be in the system and not to get it lost, right, washed out, etc. And we can see with these cores that when they actually did this early domestication, they managed to take these environments from being something where the nitrogen was just washed out to basically keep it within the system. And this, of course, is interesting because if we want to change some of our system into a system where you keep the nitrogen, one of the big challenges has been, if you go into an environment today, let's say a forest or whatever, and you say, well, I would like my field to be like the forest, right? Because it keeps the nitrogen, it's really great. You look at what kind of functions and bacteria in there, and then you put it out on your field, and what happens? They die. That's happening. Because it's not only what's in there, it's also the order by which the different microorganisms was introduced, right? And you don't know that. You're just looking at the end product, right, today. But here, you can look at how things are changing over time, right? So you can actually go in and mirror the evolution, if you want, of these additions. Okay, that was all for me, and I'll just thank you for your attention. I don't know if we have time for questions. I'm sorry I'm a bit over time here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for an extremely interesting talk. And I think we still have about 5 minutes for a couple of questions.
Don't be shy. Oh, there's one down there. Huh? Well, where do you sign up? Well, you just have to buy yourself a shield and a sword, then you are one.
I have a question to the first part.
Yes.
Does it mean that it was not the Yamnaya that domesticated the horse?
Yes. I mean, so you can say that there was a horse domestication event which was before Yamnaya, right? And separate from the horses Yamnaya might have taken up, which was basically, it was done by these Botai people. And what we can see is, if you want, that what we call the Przewalski horse, right? Which otherwise has been kind of said, well, it's the last wild horse in the world, right? Because it's living there out on the steppes and was never domesticated. That's actually not true. Because you can say the Botai horse, the first domestication that we know of the horse, is really, you can say, the ancestor to the Przewalski horse. And then all the other horses is a separate event. This might have been done by some Yamnaya-like people or somebody else, but it's separate and it's later.
So the advantage of the Yamnaya people was the chariot, actually.
Well, that's so the descendants, if you want, the children and children of the Yamnaya, they invented the chariot, and that were their big advantage. What were the advantages of the Yamnaya? Well, it's hard to say, right? I mean, they had, you can say, they were herders, right? So it's the kind of the very early herders of Europe. So they had a lot, as far as we know, a lot of animals. They were drinking milk. They also carried the genetic, you can say, the genetics that allow adult people to consume unprocessed milk, which is quite unique in the world. And so maybe that was some of the advantages that Yamnaya had. At least we can see that in the, you can say, when they meet the agricultural people, the farmers, you can say, yes, there's also problems there. They are killing each other and stuff, but they are ending well. They are mixing with each other. And you can say there's a huge influence of this Yamnaya. On the contrary, where they meet the hunter-gatherers, those that remained largely hunter-gatherers and were kind of separated, there the Yamnaya doesn't really seem to have an impact. But the children, if you want, or children, the descendants of Yamnaya, those with the chariot, they have this huge impact. And they are most likely the ones that really spread, you can say, the Indo-European language to the east, right, to Western Asia, Central Asia, etc. So it wasn't Yamnaya, but basically the descendants with the chariot that did this. Yeah.
Thank you.
You want more?
Okay, thank you.
And it's especially important that you showed, especially young people, that science is like being a detective.
Exactly. It's an adventure.
Yeah, especially nowadays when people don't have confidence in so
Yeah,
many things. So
exactly. No,
thank you
it's
very much.
exactly. It's a. I mean, if I may, I would say. I mean, I was actually really poor at school. I did very poorly in school, and when I'm sure it's probably the same here in Poland as it is in my country. I mean, all across your time in school, right? What is it you do in school? Well, you do two things. You read about what other people have done, and then when you do experiments, you do something that a lot of people also have done before, right? So the criteria of success is whether you get the same result as those that did it before, right? To me, at least, it's not very exciting. But it's very different to be a researcher, right? Because a researcher is about discovering something new, right? It's a real adventure, right? You're actually discovering something new. You're making some, even if it's a small thing, it's you who are doing it, right? You are changing the way we are looking at the world. And that's an amazing feeling. I mean, so me, who was not very interested in anything related to school, I mean, when I first did the first experiment where I discovered something new, I was sold. I knew I would want to be a scientist, right? So I'm just saying, for you that are still reading books and doing experiments that others have done, it's way more interesting when you get to do your own. Yeah.
Okay, I think there was a question over there, but that will be the last one. Okay.
So it was a very interesting talk, and as you said that you were able to see from the soil and other things the DNA of animals and plants that died many years ago. So is it possible to extract those DNAs and incorporate it in plants and animals that are today and genetically modify them to?
Yes. The answer is yes. And there's another group in the US who is doing a lot of this on animals, right? I mean, I'm working on plants and I'm working on the crops because my purpose is not to try to resurrect something. My purpose is actually that we get something to eat, right? That's kind of the main purpose here. So, but yes, it is possible and it's being done, yes.
Okay, unfortunately, I have to finish at this stage.
The last question.
Okay, one more. Very last one.
So I have a question. Have you noticed any like modern traits in Asian people that you were just surprised by? Like, were they like addicts or something?
Well, it's a good question. No, I haven't really. You can say what probably surprised me the most, but I think it makes a lot of sense when you then think about it retrospectively, is what I told you, namely that a lot of the traits we see around and kind of say, well, this is kind of a negative. We associate it with something negative, right? Because it gives an increased risk of a disease or whatever it is. And you can say what we see is it's all environmental dependent. And I think it's a very important message to bring, because at least for me, and I'm sure for many other people, it really changes your mindset of how you look at these things, right? So rather than kind of saying, well, we need to just treat this or do something, right? You can actually ask yourself whether your genetics, whether you are better off in a different setting. Do you see what I'm saying? I mean, to take it to the extreme, right? I always was told in school that you have to do what you're told, right? And I hated going to school, right? And my interpretation would be, well, my genetics is really not suited for this type of school, right? Maybe I should get to another type of school, right? And there I would actually be better off. So rather than you adapting all the time, which the way I was taught was always about adapting, right? You have to do what they say at work. You have to blah, 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 right? But rather, I mean, what the data to me suggests is the wrong way. You need to find the environment that suits you, right? We all carry this genetics with us from the past, and for what it's worth, right? We all carry it in different amounts, but for most parts, you can say there's a good side and a bad side, if you want, right? And it all depends on the environment you're in.
Okay, well, thank you very much once again.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'm quite sure that many of us have been stimulated to read more on our own about how the ancient history is being rewritten. So, well, thank you very much.